Thank you everyone and welcome to the Industry We Want deep dive webinar on living wages. Today we will be focusing on the powerful role that social dialogue and data can have on the journey in closing the living wage gap. To explore this topic, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers and a brilliant panel who will each be providing their perspective on how we can advance living wages within the industry. As people continue to join, I would invite you to get comfortable, try and turn off phone and email distractions, and give yourself the next hour to fully engage in this topic. So as we're getting started, and sometimes it's difficult to engage properly with the audience on these things, I really want to see who's in the room. So please, if you can, in the chat, share your name, your organisation, where you are in the world, and what the weather is like for you today. So to get us started, I can kick off so everyone knows who I am. My name is Emily Paradiso. I'm the Head of Global Partnerships at the Ethical Trading Initiative. The Ethical Trading Initiative is part of the Industry We Want. I am in Brighton, in the UK, on the coast, but unfortunately it's not sunny seaside weather today. It's incredibly miserable outside, and very, very grey. So really looking forward to seeing who else is with us today. Oh, great. We've got people from Berlin, Cambodia, fantastic. Surrey, Germany, Rotterdam, Munich, fantastic. London, very cloudy and rainy in London. South Germany. Wow, it's fantastic to see so many people joining from all over the world. Copenhagen, Netherlands, fantastic. Oh, I'm jealous. Oh, Australia. Thank you for joining us. Hope this time is okay for you. Very sunny today, so I'm very jealous about that. Brilliant. So I hope everyone can read those as they come through and see that you're joined by like-minded individuals all over the world that are here to try and learn more about living wages and how we can advance closing the living wage gap. Okay, so let's take a look at the agenda. So first, I'm going to give an introduction to the Industry We Want for those of you who don't know who we are. I'm then going to give an overview of the 2024 living wages metric and a pass over to our brilliant speaker, Daniela from WageIndicator Foundation, who's going to talk through the metric for 2024 and the data that sits behind that metric. It's going to hopefully be a very fascinating presentation. We're then going to have a panel discussion on the role of social dialogue and data in closing the living wage gap. When that comes, I'll give a very good introduction of our panel. I'm really happy to have such an amazing panel with us today from different perspectives, trade unions, supplier, brand, and ILO. And then finally, we're going to move on to a Q&A with the audience. So as we go through the webinar, please do just continue to add your questions throughout the webinar into the Q&A function or the chat. My colleague Hannah and Laurent will be monitoring the chat and answering questions where we can and highlighting relevant questions for us in the panel. And the panel will also be engaging in the chat as and when they can to answer questions. So hopefully we'll have a good 10 minutes at the end of the webinar for your questions. So the Industry We Want. The webinar is hosted by the Industry We Want, which is an initiative that was developed by the Ethical Trading Initiative, Fairwear and Cascale to accelerate progress on social, commercial and environmental issues in the garment and footwear sector. The Industry We Want was born of impatience and frustration with the pace of change in the industry and a belief in its potential to create lasting, positive change in the lives of garment workers and our environment. We know that this can only be truly realised when the whole value chain works together. Together, we can raise the bar and promote a level playing field, and the time to do this is now. With this purpose in mind, the Industry We Want developed a set of industry-wide metrics to measure progress on an annual basis towards action on social, commercial, and environmental progress. We wouldn't be where we are as the Industry We Want without our brilliant data partners. So I wanted to take a moment to just thank our brilliant data partners and give an overview of how they engage with the metrics. So We have Better Buying, who support us with the commercial metrics. So they look at responsible purchasing practices and how we are advancing on those. We have Worldly and the Apparel Impact Institute, who help with our greenhouse gas emission impacts of the environmental metric. And last but certainly not least, we have WageIndicator Foundation, who are with us today, who support us with the living wage metric on the social side of things. So the dashboard, what does it look like for 2024? So the dashboard synthesizes extensive wage data on 28 major garment producing countries for the living wage, the social metric. Feedback from more than 1,400 suppliers across 63 countries for the purchasing practices, the commercial metric, and estimates of sector emissions for the greenhouse gas, the environmental metric. This year's scores show varied progress in the garment industry, with improved scores in some areas and stagnation in others. For the social indicator, which focuses on living wages and is the subject of the webinar today, the wage gap metric, devised in partnership with WageIndicator Foundation, is at 49.5%. This is the gap between a minimum wage and a living wage, and it shows a concerning trend. The average percentage gap between minimum wages and the average living wage estimates across 28 key garment producing countries now stands at 49.5%, meaning that workers are receiving just over half the money they need to reach a decent standard of living. This represents a 1% increase from 2023 and a 4.5% increase from 2022. So essentially the gap is widening, things are getting worse, and despite heightened awareness and concerted efforts, workers are still facing extreme challenges in accessing the income they need to have a decent standard of living. We need to remember that these are not just abstract numbers, they represent the real struggles of workers and the impact that this has on their lives. Now, to help us understand the data behind this metric and how we got to that 49.5%, I'm going to introduce you to Daniela. Daniela Ceccon, who is the Director of Data at WageIndicator Foundation. Welcome, Daniela. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Emily, for the introduction and also for involving WageIndicator in the calculation of this wage gap metric. So a couple of words about WageIndicator. So we are a global, independent and non-profit organization. Our aim is to work towards labor market transparency. On a global scale, we work for workers, but also for employers and policymakers worldwide. As you can see in the map here, we are now in 206 countries. Can you maybe go to the next slide, please? So I go very fast through this. This is a bit our journey on a timeline. We started in 1999 with collecting salary data through the salary check, which is, by the way, still working on our sites. And we started developing a salary database. Then, of course, after some time, we decided to look into the law of wages, so into minimum wages. And in 2006, we started our minimum wages database, which is now, I think, the biggest in the world. We collect official minimum wage rates for all the countries, including India. Then in 2008, we looked at labor law as a whole with the Labor Rights Index and decent work checks. Then we started collecting collective agreements in 2011. And from 2014, we started working on the collection of prices and the calculation of cost of living, which is then used to calculate living wages, living income, and living tariff as well. As you can see, then we, are working on more and more things which are also related. So the gig economy, platform work, etc. But what is of interest now is these two databases. So the minimum wage database and the living wages database. Next slide, please. So this is the wage gap metric as it looks in the website of the industry we want. Now it's a static version, what I will use now to explain, but what you see online is an interactive visualization, where you can basically also change the currency you want to see the information in, and have some more details when you go with your mouse on the different countries. Next slide. So I would like to explain you a bit how this visual has been created and where the data is coming from, because I know there are always a lot of questions on this. So you see all the countries there, and below each country you see a small pie chart with the gap. So as Emily was saying, the gap for 2024 is 49.5%. And this is the average of all the gaps that you see here. So this is a selection of countries that we identified as being relevant for the garment sector. In short, the gap is the percentage of the living wage that is not covered by the minimum wage. So imagine the living wage is 100%, and we are showing the bit that is still missing for the minimum wage to reach that living wage level. And that is the formula we use, just for those who are a fan of maths. You can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so the brown bars that you see here represent the minimum wage. The minimum wages come from our minimum wages database. Which minimum wage did we take? This is very important. We took the lowest minimum wage for textile and garment that is applicable at country level. If there is no national minimum wage for the sector, then we pick the lowest regional minimum wage for textile and garment. If there is no sectoral minimum wage, then of course we had to take a general minimum wage. This is the case for Hungary, for example. We use the minimum wage of 564 euros in this case. Very important as well, the date that you see above is 2024. This calculation and this visual came out at the beginning of this year. So the numbers that have been used are from 2023, both for minimum wages and living wages. Italy has no minimum wage, so in this case, we decided to take the lowest wage in the textile and garment collective agreement. Next slide. Okay, the blue tiny thin bar on top represents the living wage, and this is presented in a range. We included more than just our benchmark, because we know there's more out there. So we included the WageIndicator Foundation, typical family guidance 2023 country level living wage, lower bound and higher bound, and we averaged them. So you see here for Hungary, for example, it was 630, the lower bound 795, the higher bound, the average that we took for WageIndicator is 712 in this case. Oh my God, only 1 minute. Okay, then we included the Global Living Wage Coalition for those countries where it's relevant. We took, of course, they calculate as well for a typical family. And in that case, it's all, in most cases, it's 2023 data. If in a few cases where it's older, we adapted for inflation to 2023. Then there's Asia floor wage and Europe floor wage living wages. Those are driving a bit the living wage up because they calculate the living wage for a single income earner. It's also country level data, and it's 2021 data, which we adapted to inflation to 2023. You see in the case of Hungary how high it is. So it is 1,581, but that's because, again, it's a single income earner. Next slide, please. Okay, the calculation. So for the calculation of the gap, we averaged the averages of each benchmark. So in the case of Hungary, you see in the graph, you have 712, that's the lowest, 1,581, it's the highest. So these two were averaged, and these were compared with the minimum wages. You see here the formula that we used that took us, in the case of Hungary, to a gap of 51%. Next slide. Okay, this is to conclude a bit of details on a comparison with what we saw last year. So the biggest gap decrease that we could observe is the one of South Korea, where there was a gap of 24% last year, and now it's -12. So there's basically no gap. and it's the only country this year that has no gap. And this is due to a new minimum wage that was released last year. So which, I mean, of course, had an effect on the comparison and helped to close the gap. The biggest gap increase is in Turkey, where last year we had no gap, and this year there's a 14% gap, and that's because so last year they had no gap because the minimum wage was being updated frequently to cover the increase in cost of living. But this, I mean, didn't keep up with that apparently last year. The biggest gap of 2024, as you can see on the right-hand side of the graph, is China with a gap of 73%. Last year, it was Bangladesh, but for that country, we see actually an improvement. So that's all on my side. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer in the chat during the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniela. That was really interesting. And anyone who wishes to ask Daniela a question, she's sticking about, so she'll answer any questions in the chat box. And please obviously send through your questions as well for Daniela on the Q&A. Okay, so clearly these findings indicate we need to adapt the approach that we have been previously taking to address living wage gap within the industry. Our panel will now discuss and share examples of how rigorous data and quite often the overlooked role of social dialogue can help us move the needle on living wages. So just some quick introductions before we kick off with the panel. The panel is fantastic, as you can see. We have Elva Mourelo López, who is project manager for the ILO Setting Adequate Wages programme. We have Isabelle de Lijser, Asia coordinator and living wage expert for CNV International, an organisation that supports trade unions and decent work in several supply chains in Asia, Africa and Latin America. We then have Athit, the president of the Coalition of Cambodian Apparel Workers Democratic Union. Baig, the Pakistan project director for Global Rights Compliance, which is an international human rights law and development firm based in The Hague. And we also have Camara, senior legal advisor and apparel sector lead, also from Global Rights Compliance. Fantastic. So let me just stop sharing my screen now so you can see all of our panelists' lovely faces. Brilliant. Okay, so Elva, could you please kick off our panel discussion by explaining the importance of the meeting that the ILO held in February and the key outcomes, particularly regarding social dialogue and data-driven approaches to understand and closing the living wage gap for workers?
Thank you, Emily. And well, thank you. First of all, thank you to the organizers for inviting the ILO to be part of this interesting panel. It was also very nice and very interesting to hear from the work that WageIndicator is doing to measure the wage gap. And yeah, I think it's important, first of all, to keep in mind that for many households, wages represent their main source of income. But unfortunately, millions of wage workers struggle with wages that are too low to afford for themselves and their families adequate food, decent housing, access to health services, quality care services and education for their children and other essential goods and services. The new ILO Global Wage Report, which was launched a couple of weeks ago, finds that global wages have been growing faster than inflation in recent times. For instance, in 2023, global real wages grew by 1.8%, and it is estimated that real wages will grow by 2.7% in 2024, and the highest increase in more than 15 years. And this return to positive real wage growth is good news. It's very good news. However, we must not forget that millions of workers and their families continue to suffer from the cost of living crisis that has eroded their living standards. In low-income countries, on average, almost 22% of wage workers are low pay, and this means that they earn less than half of the median hourly wage of their country. So in this context, we at the ILO believe that living wages can make a huge difference, but living wage initiatives must be conceived and implemented in the right way. And it is in this context that in March this year, the ILO governing body endorsed the conclusions of a meeting of experts on wage policies, including living wages, which took place in February this year. And these conclusions provide first an ILO perspective on the concept of living wages. Second, in these conclusions, we can also find some principles for estimating living wages. And thirdly, the conclusions also provide guidance on how living wages should be achieved through wage setting processes in line with the ILO principles on wage setting. And I would like to highlight three main outcomes from these ILO conclusions on living wages. First, to be credible and useful, living wages should be estimated in a robust and transparent way. And to ensure national and local ownership, employers and workers' organizations should be involved from the start and throughout the whole development of living wage estimates. So these ILO conclusions on living wages are very clear in terms of the importance that social dialogue has also on the estimation of living wages. Secondly, the implementation of living wages should not be a one-size-fits-all approach and should reflect local or regional differences within countries. The operationalization of living wages should be a process anchored at the national level, and this means that this process should involve the national labor market institutions, including minimum wages and collective bargaining of wages. And this includes strengthening the capacity of wage-setting institutions and the ability of social partners, trade unions, and employers' organizations to bargain collectively on wage issues and to participate in tripartite social dialogue and on wage policies. We have here Isabelle and other colleagues who work closely with social partners to strengthen their capacity to bargain collectively on wage issues. So I'm also looking forward to hearing from them and to know more about the work that they are doing in the countries in that regard. I would like also to mention that living wage initiatives should also strengthen those institutions that promote equal pay and gender equality. So we have evidence that the gender pay gap is higher among low-paid workers. So if we move towards the payment of living wages, we will also have an important impact in terms of reducing the gender pay gap. So the operationalization of living wages should aim to close gender pay gaps and end wage discrimination, taking as a basis the principle of equal pay for work of equal value. Mm-hmm. And finally, any sustainable strategy to promote living wages should go beyond the realm of wage setting mechanisms alone and include also a broader consideration of economic factors such as the capacity of enterprises to pay higher wages. So it's also important to have data and to promote a social dialogue around the root causes of low pay and inequality, such as low productivity, informality, weak institutions, and weak compliance systems. So I stop here and yeah, I give the vlog back to you, Emily.
Thanks so much, Elva. And really looking forward to kind of recommendations for stakeholders on how to turn those actions into, or recommendations into actions in the Q&A. Okay, I'd now like to introduce our second panelist, Isabelle de Lijser. Isabelle, CNV International has been supporting unions to collect data for collective bargaining and wage negotiations, Could you tell us a bit about this project, please?
Sure, and thank you very much, Emily, also for inviting us on this panel to share about our work with the trade unions. In 2022, CNV International started the Fair Work Monitor in Cambodia as a collaboration with our partner trade union CLC and Ceccon. Athit is also in the webinar here today. And through this project, we collect data on wages, working conditions, and cost of living. And this may sound strange to you because you maybe think there is so much data out there already that is collected by multi-stakeholder initiatives, audits, brands, but in fact, the unions that we are working with oftentimes do not have the access to this information. So the purpose of the survey that we started was to support the union in their annual minimum wage negotiation in Cambodia. And for this, they already conducted a paper survey every year. But by making this survey digital, the unions could reach a higher number of workers in a relatively short amount of time, and also save resources on data collection and analysis, as the data directly feeds into a system. So they don't have to go back and forth into the regions to collect the questionnaires back from the workers. The first year was quite successful, as trade unions could reach 500 workers from 30 factories in the country in a relatively short amount of time. And also the unions were enthusiastic about using this digital survey. It was, however, less successful in other ways, especially in obtaining also support from other unions in the minimum wage negotiation, as they were not part of the data collection and sometimes also conducted their own research. And so from the second year onwards, we therefore included more unions in the survey, and we had the opportunity to reach more workers and factories. And this year, we concluded the survey from the third year in a row. We have been working with 7 unions in country. We reached 2,500 workers and close to 100 factories. And currently we are preparing for a new phase. And what is good about the fact that we are doing this every year now, or have been doing this for 3 years in a row, is that we can really identify trends on wages and working conditions. So we can compare to the previous year if there are improvements or worsening conditions. Now, what stands out from the figures this year is that inflation has fortunately slowed down, but the living wage gap is still very big and a lot larger than when we started a few years ago with the survey. And that is actually also what Elva has been referring to. Workers have not recovered yet from the cost of living crisis. And you can imagine this is negatively impacting on the livelihoods of workers. And this year we added some questions on health and food security to the survey to better understand what those wage levels that people are receiving now actually mean for their lives. And to me, these results are really quite shocking, and it clearly shows the need to increase our efforts to work on higher wages. So I'm going to share some of those results with you. 73% of the workers in Cambodia in the garment sector currently face debt, and the average amount of debt has increased compared to the previous year from $6,000 to $7,000. Many of the workers borrow to pay for their basic needs, and those workers that can save money, it is just a few dollars that they can set aside to save for unexpected events. 30% of the workers run out of food towards the end of the month, and a lot of workers from this percentage, also workers, 30%, actually need to borrow money to buy food. Several of a lot part of the workers, they are in a debt cycle, I would say, spiral. So to me, these results and figures are really shocking. And I think it is good that we are collecting this data now together with the unions, so that we can see the impact of wages below the living wage through the Fair Work Monitor. But more importantly, that unions can use this data, this evidence to use in their minimum wage negotiations, as well in collective bargaining, supported by brands. We will also put the link to our recent data in the chat here, and share the link with you after the webinar. And if you don't receive it, you are welcome to approach me, as it is on our website right now. Also, for instance, if you want to know where the survey has been conducted from those 100 factories, please get in touch. We are preparing for next year's rollout currently, that will start in February. We look forward to discussing the results with you, and how we can work towards higher wages in collaboration.
Thanks so much, Isabelle. And thank you so much for sharing some of those statistics, which are, sobering and kind of bring home the reality of living wages on the lives of workers. So hard to hear, but very necessary, I think, for us to be reminded of the real impact of us discussing living wages at this level. Brilliant. I would now like to pass over to Athit Kong. Following on from Isabelle, would you be able to share a little bit about the minimum wage negotiation that she mentioned in Cambodia, talk about the process and how you have used data in that negotiation? And then I have a second question for you once you've finished answering that one. Thanks, Athit.
Yes, thank you. So, Emily, and thank you, Isabelle, and good evening from Cambodia. So, I'm Athit. I'm the president of the Ceccon, one of the federation in garment sectors. So, we represent about 50,000 members in the industry. Yes, I think let's start with the history of the minimum wage. Because before we had the annual minimum wage, we were having 5 year, the 5 year duration. After we have another wage negotiation within the tripartite body. So the first big success is the victory, the fight by the worker, that we can achieve the annual wage negotiation at the tripartite level. So I think we are having this annual negotiation started from 2012, and at the moment we have the at the beginning we have very poor capacity to present and to defend our demand in the wage negotiation, or the tripartite wage negotiation committee. So we having tried very hard to work with different partner and different academic and researchers, so to set up to collect the data, and then afterward we also have intervened from the ILO to set up the 7 criteria. So I think in the wage negotiation there's 2 sides, there's 2 parts. So one part is the data and statistic, and one part is political. So like Isabelle already mentioned, that we work with CNV from many years already, in 2022, we start this, the wage monitors projects, and we are working on improving the position papers or demand of this wage negotiation in the tripartite body, because we have a lot of fight debate, and sometimes it's unnecessary debate between the government and the union and the employers. So one of the reasons that we are collecting and this project work is to have to closer the gap of the debate, so we put our demand and our position paper based on those scientific and real collective of the evidence and things. So this is a very good projects, and this year we are now having the new minimum wage in 2025, which is 208. So among in the region, Cambodian is the highest. Even we now going to be higher than Vietnam, So, and this year, this is thanks to the, to all the partner and the fight from the workers and all those things. And this year we managed to have a very good dialogue with the company and the government through this data collection and the evidence base and the capacity building and the analysis of the trade union committee in presenting this document and the finding with the government. So the result was we are having the same what you call finding, mostly very close with the government and employer. So this is like become clearer and clearer and become crystal clear for everyone that the effective of the union and the data collection is work and support one of the 50% from what I have said about the two part. One is the statistic and one is about the political, because the government will not only look at the statistic, especially the Cambodian government, they also look at the competitiveness and all those politics and the overall economy and also all those kind of things. So this year we managed to make increase $4. So that's what I said, 2,208 in 2025 for the workers. So I think we also having quite a strong set now. So I hope we will manage to improve better, data collection through this collaboration with the CNV and other partner. So we can make more quality document into the next level of living wage negotiation with the brand, as Cambodian are doing now. So Cambodian is the first country that negotiated the higher wage than the minimum wage with the employer through the brand support that we call ACT, the Action, Collaboration and Transformation. So that is our big step ahead for this. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Athit. And when we were discussing this webinar in this panel, we had a really interesting conversation around the role of brands in these collective bargaining efforts, but with governments, between trade unions and governments, and the role that brands can play. And you touched on it when you spoke about the kind of political aspect of it and the competitiveness fears from governments. I wondered if you could just talk about a little bit about your perspective on how important the support of brands and buyers is when you're undertaking those collective bargaining efforts.
Yes, thank you. So like we have been demanding through many campaigns, through many platform, that to bring the buyer in this what you call a negotiation table. So we work with different partner, the global union. So now we get the first time global binding agreement between the industrial union and with more 20 brands under the ACT group. So now the most of the brand in the under the ACT realized and participated in this negotiation. So we are now, you know, like as a beginner of this ladder to the living wage, like what I call the ladder to living wage. So that's why the key of trying to improve our you know, evidence and data collection is very key and crucial for us to the next step. Like this year, this first CBA between the brand and the union, we in Cambodia we have managed to increase $6 higher than the 208. So this is the first time in the history. So that's why I go back to your question. So with the brand support, we can make a small progress at the beginning of this CBA. So we can show to many other brand or to the other partner that when the brand include or joining in this negotiation table, so then it can make a very big difference, right? So, and also not only benefit for the worker, but also benefit for the supplier, that in the CBA there's not only mention about the wage increase only, so about the women benefit and other benefit also, and also the benefit for the employer, for the supplier, because the supplier also demands some, you know, guarantee that many time most of the partner like worker, employer, and the government not totally, you know, believe or trusted the brand, that the brand will not move to other country, the brand will not, you know, continue their order or decrease their volume of orders. So all these things is being tested in this ACT or the global binding CBA and the CBA between the union, Cambodian union, and the supplier. So we have many things to be fulfilled. We have to continue, you know, work with social partner to push the brand, and we continue to ensure that the stability for the supplier, for the brand and the suppliers, and we also make sure that the government is not scared and not hesitate about, you know that the brand will not walk on their top and all those kind of things. So I'm quite happy and nervous at the moment, because we are at the very crucial point to set up the foundation for the future living wage for garment workers, Cambodia and other country in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Athit. Thanks for joining us today. And I think it was brilliant to hear from Isabelle and Athit on the kind of role that trade unions can play in, you know, using data to progress collective bargaining efforts. So one of the key stakeholders, and touched upon by Athit in the living wage discussion, are suppliers and manufacturers. So, but however, we know that often the topic of living wages can be very sensitive and difficult to navigate. This can be compounded by top-down approaches to data gathering, which doesn't always account for different contexts, often failing to properly gain the buy-in of suppliers and manufacturers on this journey. Now, unfortunately, we were unable to get a supplier or manufacturer to join our call today, but we are very, very lucky to have Mouna from Global Rights Compliance, who has been working very closely with suppliers in Pakistan on living wages. Mouna, welcome to the panel. My question for you would be, from your experience working with suppliers in Pakistan, how do you see the role of data and social dialogue in gaining buy-in and ownership from suppliers in tackling this living wage gap?
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Emily. It's lovely to be here and to be able to share some of our reflections from the field work we're doing in Pakistan. So in terms of our findings and our experiences working with suppliers, I think what data collection generally is seen very with a lot of skepticism. generally data just brings about this whole perception of something, some sort of conspiracy going on in the background. So in this kind of a scenario, it's we found that sort of trust building is one of the first key principles that need to be applied, whereby you ensure that all the stakeholders are sort of brought on board. They are sort of kept in the loop about this methodology or the structure that you're hoping to use to gain collect data. And as a result of this, what we have found in our data collection, where we were able to bring have the suppliers on board with us as well as the brands, is that whether we interviewed workers off-site or on-site in working for that particular supplier, we found the responses to be quite similar so far in the work we're doing in some factories. And that is very interesting. And that kind of, I think, bolsters the idea that social dialogue has a role to play in these kind of scenarios where data collection is very important. Data is very important for evidence-based advocacy to be done. We have found that this has been very useful. So trust building is something that we often start with, and then there is, I think, ensuring a holistic picture is put in place. So having a multi-stakeholder approach has helped, because sharing findings from conversations or having consultations where all the stakeholders get to sit across from each other, that has also sort of really helped in the idea of, you know, everyone getting a perspective on how the other approaches the problem. And sometimes that we have found, we practitioners working in the field assume that the others would know where they're coming from, but actually you will find that many times they don't. And with the fast changing landscape of human rights due diligence, it is becoming even more important to be sure about what everyone understands and whether everyone is on the same page in terms of their concepts and why certain processes are required. So we have been engaging in a multi-stakeholder, sort of using a multi-stakeholder approach to go about the data collection that we've been doing. Like I said, we have found the results in some cases to be quite similar, which highlights this whole idea that where there is trust and where there is where there's dialogue, which is considered to be fair and consistent between stakeholders, not only does it facilitate data gathering and credible data gathering results, which would then be acceptable to everyone in the picture, in all the stakeholders, but also sort of, ensuring that everyone is on the same page and everyone is driven towards the concept of, achieving living wage or any such requirements. Now, I've been looking at some comments in the chat about how why minimum wage versus living wage, how do you do that? And in a country like in Pakistan, and I would maybe extrapolate to South Asia, with very complex dynamics, like Athit mentioned as well, there are politics that need to be kept in mind as well. There are trade unions, there are a multitude of different actors involved. We have found that basically it's very important that everyone is, the credibility of the data is very important. So very rigorous testing, consistent approach, all of these brought together really help you to understand and really articulate what living wage is, because a lot of stakeholders, I would say in Pakistan, for example, they don't really know where to start or how to put a figure on living wage. There are different, initiatives like the WageIndicator Foundation has, has a very robust methodology, for example, but then their figures are different from Asia Floor Wage or from other such initiatives. And so often suppliers will say, well, which one do we go for? What do you recommend? And so when you have those sort of scenarios, it is, again, like I said, the principles of credibility, credible data collection processes, trust building, holistic perspectives, all of those come into play. And it's not an easy exercise to navigate through. In a country where minimum wage is only being paid out in 5% of or less than 5% of the eligible workplaces, according to the local labor law frameworks. So in that sort of a scenario, talking about living wage is very, is complex and challenging. And I think we are finding some success with suppliers by being very open about the process, very sort of transparent about why certain processes are required, and having them on board, everyone on board in the process. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Muna, for sharing the supplier perspective. So to close our panel, I now want to hand over to Grace Camara, also from GRC. Grace, so far on the panel, we have heard about advancing living wages from the perspective of trade unions and suppliers, and panelists have highlighted the important role that brands can play in social dialogue around living wages. Could you please share with us the challenges and opportunities faced by brands in advancing living wages, particularly considering recent regulatory changes? And what practical advice would you give to brands on the webinar today who want to kind of start or advance their journey on living wages within their supply chains?
Sure, absolutely. Well, thank you, Emily, and thank you to the Industry We Want for the invitation and the opportunity to present GRC's work on living wages. I mean, I'm sure we're all aware of the current international regulatory and legislative changes and developments, particularly in the EU around the CSDDD and the recent discussions around an omnibus provision of the CSDDD, CSRD, and the taxonomy legislation. But what I think will be helpful to do today is just outline some very practical options for brands and steps that brands can adopt to respond to the legislation and the changes, but also to increase and strengthen social dialogue with not just their suppliers, but with the wider stakeholders as well. Because I think, as Muna has expressed, the key to addressing this living wage gap issue is to have a multi-stakeholder approach, but a meaningful one, but also align that with the legislative requirements that we're now seeing brands being subject to. So as I mentioned, with the CSDDD transposition process and the omnibus process, we know that there will be a consultation now in February, an EU consultation looking at that. This really presents a good opportunity for brands to look at what the provisions are around living wages in the EU, and that would mainly be from a CSDDD perspective, this idea of influence and leverage and what that really means. So to really engage with their member states on ensuring that that language isn't lost in translation as part of the transposition process, to perhaps look at how that language can be explained. And there be more guidance around what it means to, implement a living wage strategy into your business processes and your management systems, and just be able to get more guidance around, what brands can do to address the issue. So I think that would be one of the key opportunities for brands. And as we're going through this transposition process, there'll be multiple consultations and opportunities, not only to engage at the EU level, but also at the member state level as well. And just to add as well, because I was in London, I've been in London the last couple of days. I'm actually based here in Brussels as part of the UK bill that is looking at due diligence, a similar provision or a similar legislation to CSDDD. So there have been a number of parliamentary meetings and committees looking at this, and we're hoping that it will be expedited. There's also a review of the Modern Slavery Act. So for those brands that are on the call today that maybe have operations in the UK or are UK brands, to be part of that process and to be very vocal about socializing this issue of living wages, because it often gets lost in the fray of, human rights due diligence and core labor rights. But, as we're seeing out of Pakistan and other projects that we run, more than 50% of complaints are wage-related complaints, and that includes this wage gap issue that we're seeing. And of course, as the ILO really helpfully set out earlier in today, we're seeing increases in the living wage gap. And this is a focus on tier 1, perhaps in the garment sector and factories, but beyond tier 1, we know in more opaque supply chains, and when you now talk about living income and smallholders, it becomes even more complex. So I think it's really important as these legislative processes are ongoing, for brands to take that opportunity to have these discussions and bring to the table what their commercial pain points are, and also the pain points of suppliers as well. We also see at the international level with the OECD, they recently published their handbook on living wages a few months ago. And I think it's a really helpful, practical tool for brands, particularly for those brands who are addressing this subject for the first time and maybe don't have a lot of capability or resource in-house, to look at sort of what would be the best practice and expectation around addressing the issue of living wages. And the handbook helpfully provides this 6-step due diligence process that brands can at least start having the conversation internally. And that includes things like embedding, a living wage policies within your management systems. And from a very practical perspective, that usually looks like, say, having codes of conduct which have a clear living wage statement or commitment, having two-way supplier codes of conduct which don't just put the onus on the buyer or the brand, but also don't just put the onus on the supplier rather, but also put the onus on the buyer as well, on the brand, to address the issue. And that may be in terms of practical steps, that may be things like ring fencing funds for incremental wage increases over time. Yeah. It may also be committing to more longer term contracts so that the suppliers feel more comfortable to make these changes and investments, because it's very difficult for suppliers to commit to things if they're only contracted for 1 or 2 years. So these are very sort of practical steps that brands can take. In addition to that, with this 6-step process, you'll always have this idea of disclosure as well. I think it's step 5. So communicating what you're doing publicly. You may be, as EU brands, required to do that under CSRD anyway, but even if you're not, it's very good best practice to make sure that you publicly communicate what you're doing on living wages, and you're showing your commitment to addressing the issue, at least at tier 1. So tier 1 disclosures. And then just to close up very quickly with stakeholder engagement, of course, this is key. We've talked about it here. We have multiple stakeholders here, which I think is a nice example of where brands would start in that discussion. But stakeholder engagement is only as effective as sort of the terms that you define when you're undergoing those discussions. So it's really important to set expectations and have clear outcomes and objectives of what you want to achieve through that engagement, and also to identify the key stakeholders. So it will be, in addition to those here, obviously, it will also be.
Thanks, Grace. Thank you. I'm really sorry thank you so much. That was so interesting. I'm conscious we have less than a minute left. And I know that people are going to probably have meetings that they need to get off to quite quickly. So I just wanted to thank everyone so much for joining. There was a really interesting question in the Q&A around, the gap is clearly widening. Why? Why is the gap widening? And I really wanted to go to the panel with that question to have everyone's input and thoughts on that to close off the webinar. But I think we are literally almost at time. Maybe I could just ask Elva if you're able to just kind of give your closing remarks. So I don't think we'll have time for everyone, but it would be great, Elva, to get your closing remarks in light of that question. The gap is widening, why and how do we move forward?
Thank you, Emily. Well, very quickly, I think the gap it's widening, as the colleague from WageIndicator show. I think one of the reasons is, of course, the impact of the cost of living crisis. We have seen a huge increase in inflation over the last years. And then something that we also see in the last ILO Global Wage report is that the increase, the adjustment in minimum wages has not been enough to cover this increase in the cost of living. So for instance, in 55% of the countries that we analyze in the report, they have increased the minimum wage in real terms in 2023, but this increase has not been large enough to compensate for the declines in previous 2 years. So I think even if we are seeing some improvements in terms of adjustment of minimum wages, these adjustments have not been enough to compensate for the huge impact that the cost of living crisis had in wages. So yeah, I think maybe we can close with
Brilliant. Thank you, Elva.
and the ILO data.
Thank you. That's really brilliant. And thank you so much to all of our panelists, our speakers. Daniela, thank you so much for answering everyone's questions in the chat about the data. Thank you so much for everyone joining today to hear from our brilliant speakers and panelists all around living wages, social dialogue and data collection, and how we can advance the kind of journey on living wages and start closing that gap for workers in the garment supply chains who desperately need to access a proper decent living wage to be able to meet their needs. So thank you so much for joining, everyone. Apologies we didn't have lots of time for Q&A, but have a great day and see you all soon on the next webinar.